Shazam!
It's a good episode.
I'm excited, man, because Captain Marvel is one of my favorite things in the world. When I was a kid, that was like one of my pretty much my main favorite character and favorite comic.
Really?
For a very good chunk of time when I was a young kid, yeah.
How did you first discover Captain Marvel?
Well, I'm Rocko Jerome.
And I'm Jeremy Hicks.
And this is the Penultimate podcast. I first became really aware of Captain Marvel because a friend of mine, or really a friend of my cousin's, who later became a friend of mine, a guy named Marcus, who lived in the neighborhood and was a little bit older than both of us, was around for the 70s rejuvenation, whatever, of Captain Marvel.
Right.
And he was like, man, my favorite guy is Captain Marvel. And he was one of those guys who was always like into like who could beat up who.
Yeah.
He was like, Captain Marvel could beat up everybody. He's got all the best powers. And he was like, you got to check it out. It's called Shazam, though. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I kind of knew. Like, it was sort of something that had been around in the background of my mind. And I kind of remembered the cartoon, which there was one. And so the next time I went to The Great Escape, I looked and I found some issues of Shazam from 1973, which at that point was the oldest comic book that I had ever been able to afford. I remember that it was like $3 for the second issue or so of Shazam. And the story was written by Denny O'Neil, and the art was by C.C. Beck, who was the original guy who did Captain Marvel, as it turns out.
Right.
And it was about this kid who was displaced in time. He was a kid from the 40s, and he was trying to deal with the 70s, and it wasn't groovy. You know, you had a lot of bell bottoms and stuff, and he couldn't figure it out. And I just kind of felt similar. I think it spoke to me because I always felt like I was kind of born at the wrong time.
Yeah.
And I really think that was the thing that sort of first originally started to kind of get me into the concept.
Well, this episode completes a trilogy of episodes that we did not mean to turn into a trilogy, and thanks to me, it's spawned into this. But I think it's interesting. The story of Captain Marvel is interesting because I knew all of these pieces of this character, but I wasn't quite sure how they fit. And so I thought it was really interesting to sort of see the evolution of this character, what all this character became.
Right.
Because it's much like Solar's origin is somewhat convoluted.
Sure. Well, one thing that's important to note for me is that there is no evolution of the character as far as I'm concerned.
Please explain.
We'll get into that.
Okay.
So when you think about Peanuts, you think about Charles Schultz.
Sure.
And you think about Charlie Brown as being a character with a round head that's much bigger than his body should allow, because it's a stylistic choice, who has a design on his shirt, and he has a world that you know. He's got Snoopy. There's a certain tone to the Peanuts world, and that's what Peanuts is. Peanuts is not Saved by the Bell. Peanuts is not NYPD Blue. Peanuts is Peanuts, right? And Captain Marvel and his Marvel family were in large part created by C.C. Beck, who was the artist, and a guy named Otto Binder, who was the writer. And they're very whimsical tales. It has more in common with the tone of Peanuts than it does with Superman, to be honest. It's not really a book that's so much a serious superhero book. It was designed to be humorous. In a lot of cases, Captain Marvel comics were sort of a parody of things that were going on in the world. It kind of had more in common with like The Simpsons. It was almost like The Simpsons of its day.
So the stuff that you're referring to, you're talking about the stuff that was released in the 70s or the stuff in the 40s?
In the 40s.
Okay, that's what I thought.
When Captain Marvel was at its height.
So you were a kid reading 1940s comic books?
Reprints of those, yes.
Wow.
Right.
That's impressive.
Yeah. So let's get into the history, and then we'll be able to kind of catch up.
Okay, so Fawcett Comics, a division of Fawcett Publications, was one of several successful comic book publishers during the golden age of comic books in the 1940s.
Very much so. One of the important things to note here is that it was not strictly a comic book company. The Fawcett brothers created a lot of big magazines, including Good Housekeeping. So they were already very well-to-do and knew what they were doing with publishing before they entered the world of comics.
Okay.
That's very important later.
Its most popular character was Captain Marvel, the alter ego of radio reporter Billy Batson, a boy who, by speaking the magic word Shazam, can transform himself into a costumed adult with the powers of superhuman strength, speed, flight, and other abilities. Now, for better or worse, you and I usually do not collaborate or coordinate our episodes. So it's like you go in your corner and do your thing, I go in my corner, do mine. So I had no idea you had this affinity for this character.
Oh, absolutely.
So with that said, I was going to ask if you know what Shazam stands for.
Solomon, Hercules, Achilles, Zeus, Atlas, and Mercury.
Close, Achilles.
What did I say?
Well, you know what? I think you just said them out of order. So, yeah. So, so anyway, the point being is that I was going to ask you what it stood for, but of course you know what it stands for. It's one of your favorite characters.
Right.
And I didn't know that.
From childhood, back when my mind was such that I could absorb this stuff.
So other characters published by Fawcett included Ibis the Invincible, Bullet Man and Bullet Girl, Spy Master, among others.
And these were all characters that were like not even fucking close to the level of popularity of Captain Marvel.
Yeah.
I mean, this wasn't like an Aquaman. Like, this was like... These characters were not anything.
And I'll be honest with you, I had no idea that Captain Marvel was as popular as what he was.
It's huge. It was the biggest comic book ever.
So, Fawcett Publications began in 1919 with the magazine Captain Billy's Whiz Bang, and eventually expanded into a line of periodicals with a combined circulation of 10 million a month.
Right, they're huge.
The company joined in the explosion of comic book publications in the United States in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Its initial entry, developed by writer Bill Parker and artist C.C. Beck, was Thrill Comics, a single issue of which was published only as an... The content was then reworked. For example, the lead character of Captain Thunder was renamed to Captain Marvel and published as Whiz Comics number 2 in February 1940. Right. So see, I had no idea that he had even started out as Captain Thunder.
Okay, so there was a thing called... There was Whiz Comics number 1.
Right.
Right? And that was what was called an ash can edition, which meant that it was designed to secure copyright. It was never meant to be seen by anybody. So they published like 10 of those. Nobody has them. They're gone.
Yeah.
Totally gone. And what they did, full disclosure, huge fan, I can admit this, was they made something that was as akin to Superman as they possibly figured they could get away with.
So it was intentional.
I mean, yeah. It was like the first cover had Captain Thunder at the time throwing a car. Just like the first issue of Action.
Yeah.
Right? You had a guy in what was then considered like a strongman circus costume.
Yeah.
With a cape, black hair, doing super heroic type shit.
Yeah.
And they were like, okay, so what can we do? But I mean, to be fair, Superman was a ripoff of a lot of shit too.
Such as?
Doc Savage is the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
The first issue of Batman was nothing but a complete and total ripoff of an issue or a story of The Shadow.
Yeah.
There was a story of The Shadow that was exactly what that issue of Detective Comics was. So back then, nobody's hands were clean where that was concerned.
Well, and I think that this is a common theme that's come up when talking about a lot of these publishers. It's just a lot of shady shit went down.
So that's where it began, okay? Now, if you go back and you look at the first few issues of Whiz Comics, they are not that good. They were still figuring it out. And C.C. Beck is an artist who I would describe as a cartoonist, right? He didn't do anything remotely looking like reality. But in the early days, he was kind of trying for it. But then it became something that was, it's more just like a few lines denote a person's face. And he's able to do it artfully so that face can give you everything you need. Just a few lines can give you happiness, sadness, stress, all that stuff. He was one of the greats where that kind of thing is concerned.
In addition to Beck, the lineup of artists who contributed to Fawcett Comics include Jack Kirby and Joe Simon.
Sure. Yeah, Kirby did a few issues early on that are extremely dynamic and really cool.
Anything stand out?
I think that maybe it's like, I'm never good with numbers, but it was within like the first 10 issues of Wiz.
Okay.
There's one particular panel where Captain Marvel has got a hold of somebody's ankle and he's flinging him around and he's throwing another guy at a window. And I remember that the first time that I saw those, because, okay, so you're familiar with the DC archive books that they put out. They always do a thing where they begin at the very beginning, because a lot of fans are psychos about that shit. And they want to see the book from the beginning, was concerned. The earliest issues of Wiz are not the good stuff. The good stuff is Captain Marvel Adventures once you get into like issue 30 or so.
Yeah.
And that was the book that Otto Binder and C.C. Beck were working on directly. And Wiz ended up becoming the book that other artists would do and is never as good. When I go and buy one of these things, which luckily we can do without a lot of tribulation, because one, they were very popular, so there's a lot of them out there, relatively, comparatively. Number two, not a lot of people care about the characters anymore. Number three, they were published in Louisville.
Oh,
so
really?
Louisville is lousy with Captain Marvel Adventures. They're always getting found in somebody's attic or something from where, Dad got to bring home a pile of comic books and the kid was more into football.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool. Through much of the golden age of comic books, Captain Marvel proved to be the most popular superhero character of the medium, and his comics outsold all others. Captain Marvel Adventures sold 14 million copies in 1944 and was at one point being published bi-weekly with a circulation of 1.3 million copies an issue.
Yep.
The whimsical adventures of Captain Marvel and the Marvel family, which included Captain Marvel Jr., Mary Marvel, the Lieutenants Marvel, etc., eventually outsold those of Superman.
Now, here's another important thing to note. Mary was also created by Otto Binder, and he had a daughter named Mary. And Mary was hit by a car and killed sometime in the 60s, or maybe the 70s. And after that, he retired from comics. So he was out of the picture. It's very, very sad, yeah. And he was a hell of a guy from all accounts. He and his whole family were very warm and loving people. Now, Captain Marvel Jr., I believe, was an Otto Binder conceptual creation as well. But the thing that set Captain Marvel Jr. apart was that the art was done by a guy named Macra Boy. And Macra Boy had his style almost looked like medieval British paintings. Like it had almost sort of like, in terms of a comic style, sort of like the Prince Valiant. Like there was a lot of detail in those.
Yeah.
And although Billy Batson, who was the Captain Marvel kid, his background was that he was an orphan, Captain Marvel Jr. was orphaned. He had a grandfather who was his only caretaker, who was murdered by a Nazi. He had his leg nearly broken off. He was crippled. And he would have he didn't have Shazam. He would say Captain Marvel to get his powers. So he couldn't even say his own name, right?
Yeah.
Like there was something really dark and sad about Captain Marvel Jr. in a heavy, heavy way. And he was a very different thing from Captain Marvel. Like they had a Marvel family book where they would find a way to kind of draw him so he didn't look too weird in that context. But the books that are just Captain Marvel Jr., and they would deal with like the occult. Like he would battle witches and like satanic monsters. And it was a very different feeling book. And it was always a very sort of maudlin character.
Interesting.
It's a very interesting dichotomy because it was different than anything else that was being published at the time.
See, I would have assumed that it would have just been a clone of Captain Marvel.
You would think, but he wasn't at all. Yeah. And a very young Elvis Presley was fascinated by Captain Marvel Jr. He patterned his hairdo after Captain Marvel Jr., his wispy kind of pompadour, which you can see. And in the 70s, when he would wear his big cape with the
collar,
all of that stuff was inspired by Captain Marvel Jr. The TCB, taking care of business symbol with the lightning bolt, taking care of business in a flash.
Yeah.
That is the Captain Marvel and de facto Captain Marvel Jr. lightning bolt.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
Some of the greatest comics of the period. I mean, they're so far out and weird. And Macroboy, brilliant artist. And I don't think anybody even really knows what happened to him.
So do you prefer the Captain Marvel Jr. stuff over Captain Marvel, or did just sort of two sides of the same coin?
Vastly different. I mean, I'm going to go ahead and say that what Otto Binder and CC Beck were doing was more brilliant, because they were able to sort of make a lot of things work at once. They were able to make it into a cohesive cartoon character that was really, they were really onto something.
Yeah.
Whereas Macroboy maybe would have been better suited to have just done a different kind of book. Captain Marvel Jr. was just kind of a misfit toy in a lot of ways. I
thought this was interesting. Captain Marvel was also the first comic book superhero to be adapted into film in a 1941 Republic Pictures serial titled Adventures of Captain Marvel.
Yeah.
Have you watched that?
Fuck yes, I have. Man, so much fun. Okay, so movie serials was a deal where, like, every week down at the movie theater, they would show a bunch of these, and you would send your kid. You give your kid a quarter, send him the hell out of the house, leave me alone. Go watch the movie serials. And every week there would be a new half-hour installment of these things. And there would be a set of them that you would see. So it's a lot different than the comic. It made C.C. Beck mad, but a lot of things did. They depicted him as being like almost murderous. Like first of all, Billy Batson was like not a kid. He was just kind of like a young man. And he would say the word, and a lot of the guy who played Captain Marvel was a guy named Tom Tyler, who was in a lot of those things. He was a really great physical actor, not unlike Johnny Weissmuller, who played Tarzan. He was an athlete. Yeah. So he was like a long-legged, strong guy who could run around and jump and not look too totally dopey in this situation. And they had a really great special effect, by my estimation, of Captain Marvel jumping, where Tom Tyler would like hop and then jump, and then they would cut to a dummy being fired from a cannon, right? You didn't see the cannon, you just saw the dummy.
Right.
And then you'd see another dummy attached to a wire flying through the air with the cape fluttering, and then Tom Tyler would tackle a guy and knock him to the ground and smack his face in the dirt.
Nice.
And all of that would happen within 4 seconds. Like, this is pow! And it's nuts.
The magic of editing.
Yeah. And it really is. I mean, it was made, in 1940 or whatever. But to this day, it's still, to me, some of the most exciting stuff. And it's again, it's one of those things where it is different from the comic, but it's its own thing.
Well, again, not knowing that you were into Captain Marvel so much, I was going to ask you if you knew about his narration. So I thought this was interesting. I wrote, did you know that Billy Batson typically narrated each Captain Marvel story, speaking directly to his reading audience from his Whiz radio microphone?
Yeah, and see, this was a big thing, because it was the kid was the driving force of the thing.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of kids that would read the comics, and it wasn't like it's Robin, where it's the sidekick, and you imagine yourself as, hanging out with your dad who is Batman. Like in this case, he says the word, and they would never really get quite clear on like if he was Captain Marvel or if Captain Marvel took over. Like that was the kind of thing they didn't get. That was way before Roy Thomas was around to explain everything to death. So it was never really clear who was who.
Well, people seem to be drawn to Deadpool. Like one of the appeals of Deadpool is him breaking the fourth wall. Sure. It's like, here's your OG fourth wall breaking right here. So I mean, I had no idea.
But I mean, he would only break the wall so much in that it would be like, boy, guys, if I got a story for you.
Right.
Let me tell you about the time that Captain Marvel fought Dr. Savannah in the middle of the desert. Whatever, I mean, that was always kind of the way that would work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not necessarily to the extent of Deadpool, but at the same time, the concept of breaking the fourth wall, you probably owe that to Captain Marvel.
Also, the first time that you had a story that ran in sequential chapters. as a result of the success of the movie serial and movie serials in general, they did something called Captain Marvel versus the Monster Society of Evil, where they had a series of... See, back then a comic book wouldn't be made up of one story when you would buy the issue. It would be made up of several, like 6 to 12-page stories. And they would all be lined up together, and you would read them whenever at your convenience, whatever.
Yeah.
So during the Monster Society of Evil series, it was this mysterious villain called Mr. Mind sort of created a coalition of villains, including Hitler, to try to kill Captain Marvel. And Captain Marvel is going all over the world and doing all this stuff. And I think it was maybe like 20 chapters. And then it finally turned out that Mr. Mind was a little worm who, in the end of the story, got the electric chair. And I had a guy named Bob Grimes, who I haven't seen in a long time. I hope he's still with us or he's doing well. Who told me, he said, when Mr. Minds was revealed to be that worm, it was the biggest thing that ever happened in my neighborhood for the kids.
Detective Comics, later known as National Comics Publications, National Periodical Publications, and today known as DC Comics, sued both Fawcett Comics and Republic Pictures for copyright infringement in 1941, alleging that Captain Marvel was based on their character Superman. After 7 years of litigation, the National Comics Publications v. Fawcett Publications case went to trial in 1948. Although the presiding judge decided that Captain Marvel was an infringement, DC was found to be negligent in copyrighting several of their Superman Daily newspaper strips, and it was decided that National had abandoned the Superman copyright. As a result, the initial verdict, delivered in 1951, went in Fawcett's favor.
Right.
So,
okay. It was dismissed twice over the course of those 7 years.
Really?
It's like, you don't have a case. Like, these ideas have been circulating for a long time. It was a deal where National only had comics. Fawcett had a lot. They had a whole publishing fucking empire. In addition to Captain Marvel, the biggest comic book character that was going. And it was a situation where they could just handle the slugfest. And by this time, the stories were so very different because Superman was always rooted in science fiction and in a world that took itself very seriously, whereas Captain Marvel was not. It was a whimsical, magical thing, right? So there weren't a whole lot of situations by that point at which they seemed any more similar or dissimilar than any other superhero. And for a lot of people that were working in the courts, and especially if you were going to get to a jury, they didn't give a fuck. I mean, you didn't have any of the shit today, like we have with like adults who were into this stuff. Like to them, it was just like, what? What is this shit? Like, read a real book. Like, what are you talking about? So what ended up happening in the long run, and what led to the end of the road for Fawcett as far as comics were concerned, was that there was a pretty hacky artist who I've always kind of wondered about this because it felt like it may have been done deliberately and that maybe National went ahead and greased this guy's palm. But he had worked for Fawcett and he just flat out stole an image of Superman. He traced it. He traced Superman but made it Captain Marvel and it saw publication. And that guy was like the smoking gun.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So National appealed this decision,
right,
and Judge Learned Hand declared in 1952 that National's Superman copyright was in fact valid.
Right.
Instead of retrying the case, however, Fawcett settled with National out of court, agreeing to permanently cease publication of comics with the Captain Marvel related characters,
right,
and to pay National $400,000 in damages.
Right. And now at that point, that wasn't a lot of money for them. And superhero comics were starting to lose steam. Actually, by that point, they were on their way out.
Well, yeah, because I was getting ready to say, facing a declining comics market, and because of DC's copyright infringement suit, in 1953, Fawcett Comics ceased publication of its superhero titles, though the non-comic book divisions of Fawcett continued to publish.
They had Good Housekeeping. Back when Good Housekeeping was something people were really concerned about. They didn't have to do it anymore.
Yeah.
And they didn't feel the need to keep fighting. I mean, it was a family business. It was a bunch of brothers who wanted to hang on their yacht. They didn't want to have to go to these court proceedings.
Yeah.
So
sounds like the Image guys.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. Sure. I mean, it's just one of those deals where, it's just it's too bad from a fan standpoint, but at the same time, they made a lot of issues of Captain Marvel Adventures, and they're all pretty great. And I don't have a quarter of them. So I can still go back to that well.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So we're looking at roughly a decade, 12-year period here. How many issues would you say that was released of just the Captain Marvel series?
Books?
Yeah,
the Captain Marvel Adventures books. I know that they got past 200 because I have issue 200, and it came out in, I think, like 1946 or so. So there's a lot of them.
Yeah,
and they're all pretty good. One of my favorite, so this is one that I always talk about, and I point it out as one that's like, tell me any other comic book that you've ever read that's even remotely like this. Captain Marvel had a friend named Talkie Tawny, and Talkie Tawny was a talking tiger.
Yeah.
Who learned how to talk, and he wore a suit, and he walked around. He had an ascot with a diamond in it. Like, he was quite a committed guy. And he had a job at the museum, because he loved history and art. And he was a tour guide at the museum. And there was a guy who decided that he wanted Talkie Tawny's job. And he decided that the best way that he could get Talkie Tawny's job was to make Talkie Tawny feel uncomfortable about himself in his role as a tiger in society. So he wore various disguises, and he went to the museum, and he went on a tour with Talkie Tawny. And he stepped on Talkie Tawny's tail as he was giving his speech and showing people around the art. And he was like, "Oh, I didn't see your tail. Oh, you're a tiger." And he did other things, like he would go and put on a disguise and do other things to make Talkie Tawny, until Talkie Tawny finally said, "I can't do this anymore. I'm a tiger." And he took off his clothes and he went to the jungle. And Captain Marvel was sad.
That's a sad story.
Yeah. And then there was a fire. He comes upon a house and there's a fire. And he goes in to rescue the people. And the people are like, "It's a tiger. How much worse can this get? Our house is on fire and now we're being attacked by a tiger." And he's like, "No, but I'm Talkie Tawny. I can talk. I got taught how to talk." And so he has this crisis. And then Captain Marvel, meanwhile, finds out that this, I forget how, but he finds out that this guy did this shit to Talkie Tawny. And Captain Marvel beats his ass and goes and finds Talkie Tawny just as he's having this conundrum and says, "Talkie, it's okay. Don't worry about it." And then Talkie Tawny's like, "You're my best friend." And at the end, he's back in his suit and he's working at the museum again.
That's a good story.
It's crazy. I mean, that's an episode of The Simpsons. It is. It totally is.
That's, I don't know. It strikes me as being pretty profound for a comic book from the 1940s.
It was the best comic book of its time.
Yeah.
It really was. For what it was doing, which was very unique, it was the best comic book around. There's another one where C.C. Beck had apparently, surrealism was starting to come in with Dali and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think C.C. Beck was like, "I can do that shit." So Captain Marvel faced off against the surrealist imp, where this imp came and he was making, like clocks melt, and he was making lamps come to life and all this stuff. And Captain Marvel had to face him down. At the end, it's like Captain Marvel's like, "Boy, I don't know what's going on these days. Things are getting weird." And it was a commentary, it was a meta commentary on the state of art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So something here's something that'll sound familiar. Several of Fawcett's completed stories and artwork, as well as a few characters, were sold to Charlton Comics. Fawcett returned to publishing comics in the 1960s, mainly publishing Dennis the Menace and other such titles.
Right. Stuff that was already produced,
Yeah.
basically. The newspaper strips, just condensed.
So I think that this era of Captain Marvel is already fascinating enough, but it really, in the 1960s, is when you start seeing these other iterations of the character.
Yeah.
And so, with that said, in the late 1960s, Marvel Comics gained the trademark Captain Marvel with their first series. The first Captain Marvel was created by Stan Lee and Gene Colan in Marvel Superheroes 12. This character is an alien military officer, Captain Marvel of the Kree Imperial Militia, who is sent to observe the planet Earth as it is developing technology to travel into space. Marvel eventually wearies of his superior's malign intent and allies himself with Earth, and the Kree Empire brands him a traitor. From then on, Marvel fights to protect Earth from all other threats.
Right.
Did you ever check out any of the old Captain Marvel stuff?
Sure. One of the key things about that situation, too, is that character was created for no other reason initially than to secure a copyright.
Right.
Because, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, I try not to be one of those people that's like, Marvel does this, DC does this. There were people that were working at those companies that did things.
Yeah.
Some of those people were creative people. A lot of them were bean counters who came up with legal edicts.
Yeah.
Totally different type of a thing. So, in this case, you really can't blame anybody at Marvel because they wanted to make sure that they secured the copyrights and no other company could put out a comic book called Captain Marvel and have it be a DC book or a Charlton book or anything else. So they had to nail it down. Since that name was floating around in the ether, they had no choice but to do that.
And it's interesting because since all this started with Marvel securing the trademark, you will sort of see, people continuously pushing the boundaries of what they can and can't get away with from a legal standpoint.
Right, yeah.
So in 1972, DC Comics licensed the Marvel family characters from Fawcett,
Right.
and in 1994 purchased Captain Marvel and his related characters.
A lot of stuff happened in the middle there.
Hey, you should be proud of me for trying to keep this short. Released in 1973, the Shazam comic series
Right.
began with Shazam #1.
Right.
It contained both new stories and reprints from the 1940s and 50s.
Right. And also, the first issue says Shazam, the original Captain Marvel,
Yep.
right on the cover.
Yep.
And you had a situation where Superman was introducing Captain Marvel, like, as a DC book. And now when they did this, when they secured this, they were like, okay, this was when you sort of had your first sense of nostalgia-based comic book fans, right?
Okay.
This was sort of like towards the beginning of something that would become the speculator market, right?
Yeah.
So that was one of the first situations where they had a first issue of a comic, and they were like, this is going to be big, guys. We're bringing back Captain Marvel, the biggest character ever. People like comic books again. You know, the kids from the 60s were getting to be adults. Like, this is some shit. Like, this is a big deal.
Yeah.
So Otto Binder, again, was incommunicado. He didn't want anything to do with it. After his daughter died, he was out of the picture. And C.C. Beck, who was always an eccentric character, was becoming more and more disenchanted with the modern world. He was a guy who played a banjo and had a curly mustache and big glasses. Like, he was a character of a guy. He kind of looked a little bit like Colonel Sanders.
Okay.
Dude. But they were able to talk him into it, right? And they paired him up with Denny O'Neil, which was probably a really bad idea because there was nobody who was more emblematic of the time. It was more sort of nebbishy in his own way than Denny O'Neil. I like Denny's work. He certainly has had a way of pissing people off over the years, and he did that with C.C. Beck in fairly short order.
Yeah.
So the conceit of the story was it was not unlike the Captain America story. He was Captain Marvel and Dr. Savannah, his opposite number, and his family and everybody. There was a thing that happened, and they all got frozen in time, and it was the 70s. But for these characters, they were emerging from having been in a situation of deep sleep since the last time we saw them in 1950 or whatever. And there was a little bit of a sense of time passing for Captain Marvel. Like, Billy Batson was supposed to have gone from like 11 to like 15 over the course of those years. So it was kind of like Marvel time, where time moves, but just at a glacial pace.
Sure.
So, C.C. Beck didn't like being told what to do by this young guy, because he liked his relationship with Otto. Mm-hmm. And he missed it. So the first, I think, 3 to 5 issues have C.C. Beck content, and they're good. They're really good. They're some of my favorite comics ever.
Well, let me. It's some of the things you're talking about. Let me flesh some of that out for you.
Yeah.
So Dennis O'Neil was the primary writer of the book.
Right.
C.C. Beck drew stories for the first 10 issues.
10 issues. Okay.
Before quitting due to creative differences. Okay. Because of Marvel's trademark, DC has instead used the trademark Shazam as the title of the Captain Marvel-related comic books, and thus the name under which they market and promote the character.
Important to note, the character was not called Shazam in those days. He was called Captain Marvel. Shazam was the old wizard who gave him his powers.
Initially, DC attempted to give the Shazam book the subtitle The Original Captain Marvel, but a cease and desist letter from Marvel Comics forced them to change the subtitle to The World's Mightiest Mortal.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so thought that was interesting, and that's what I meant by sort of people pushing the boundaries of what they can and can't get away with.
Yeah.
So with DC's parallel universes concept in effect during this period, the revived Marvel family and related characters lived within the DC multiverse on the alternate world of Earth S. Mm-hmm. While the series began with a great deal of fanfare, the book had a lackluster reception with their while the series began with a great deal of fanfare, the book had a lackluster reception.
And a lot of that was just because their heads weren't where they were anymore in the 40s. And they weren't really prepared to accept the book for what it was. The idea then was that it needed to be super serious. They were moving into that whole, like, comics aren't just for kids kind of thing. So they wanted to kind of swear off those sort of Peanuts type elements. And there was a cartoon and a TV show with a real guy. Like, they had put all this stuff in motion to, like, yes, we're going to make this a success. But in truth, it never really quite caught on. Even with the cartoon and the TV show. It's something that's remembered now as a strange oddity, you know. And a 70s phenomenon for a lot of people, which is strange for me because it's not a 70s. It's pure 40s when you really do the research.
Yeah. And here's something that'll sound familiar. With their 1985 Crisis on Infinite Earths limited series, DC fully integrated the characters, relaunching its comic book properties in 2011 under the New 52 initiative. DC officially renamed the character Shazam. Mm-hmm. So rebranding the character Shazam, obviously a more contemporary update. So why do you think that they finally decided to finally do that?
I try to think about it as little as possible, to be honest.
Have you checked out any of the New 52 Shazam stuff?
Nah, it's not for me.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, okay, all right, so I always say creators are more important than characters. Creators over characters. And the hard lesson that I learned as a boy about that informed everything that has come from me since, ultimately. And it all comes from Captain Marvel. Because I didn't understand at that early age that it wasn't so much this character that I liked C.C. Beck. And as I would read the reprints, I liked Macro Boy, and I liked Otto Binder. So I would keep getting these Captain Marvel Shazam comic books because they said Shazam on the front. But they were shit, almost across the board. Some of them were more shitty than others.
Yeah.
But overall, they were all derivative, confused shit. Nobody was ever able to make that work again. It was such a weird concept. And there was so much to it, and yet it seemed very simple. And people would dumb it down. People would try to make it more complex than it needed to be. Nobody ever got it right again. And I kept going back to that well and drinking that dirty water because I thought I was supposed to. And I finally gave up. And my life has been better ever since.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that, there's some characters I'm drawn to more than others, but I never read a book just because it's a character.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, it's, I think writers, artists, obviously play a big part of that. And if anything, I will gravitate more towards a writer or an artist with a property that I know nothing about just because they're attached. For example, I've never been a big fan of the New Gods, but because I like Tom King, I checked out this Mr. Miracle series.
Right.
So
the Jack Kirby New Gods is something we should talk about at some point. It's some of the greatest comics ever.
That's what I hear.
Yeah.
So to shift gears to sort of the yet another incarnation of Captain Marvel is in the 1950s, a small British publisher, L. Miller and Son, published a number of black and white reprints of American comic books, including the Captain Marvel series.
Right.
With the outcome of the National v. Fawcett lawsuit, L. Miller and Son found their supply of Captain Marvel material abruptly cut off. They requested the help of a British comic writer, Mick Anglo, who created a thinly disguised version of the superhero called Marvel Man.
And Mick Anglo was like Michelangelo, so it was obviously a pseudonym. That some guy who was like, one day I'm going to make my real mark on the art world, but right now I'm going to do this shit.
Do you happen to know his real name?
No, I've heard it, but I read it, but I don't remember.
Captain Marvel Jr. was adapted to create young Marvel Man, while Mary Marvel had her gender changed to create the male Kid Marvel Man.
Right.
The word Shazam was replaced with Komoda, which is atomic spelled backwards.
Right. The key harmonic of the universe.
Yeah. The new characters took over the numbering of the original Captain Marvel's United Kingdom series with issue 25.
Yep.
Marvel Man ceased publication in 1963, but the character was revived in 1982 by writer Alan Moore in the pages of Warrior magazine. Beginning in 1985, Moore's black and white serialized adventures were reprinted in color by Eclipse Comics under the new title Miracle Man.
Right. Which they did that because, so this gets so fucking good. So the Marvel Man stuff that Alan Moore was doing, the guy who was the editor of that, and I should be careful about this because he's gotten mad at me in the past, but I think this is true, was a guy named Des Skin. And Des Skin said, yeah, let's just do some Marvel Man comics. I've got the rights. Sure, let's do them. So they did this really interesting thing with Marvel Man where it was like a real world thing of like this guy has grown up.
And this is what they're doing in Warrior magazine.
Yes. And how it works over in England was that comics, even Marvel comics, would come out in magazine format, usually in black and white, and they would be sort of serialized similar to the way that comics have been in the 40s, where you get like 12 pages at a time.
Yeah. So
there's several stories. There would be like a Judge Dredd. That would actually be 2000 AD, but you get the gist. Like there would be a lot of different characters in there. And he was doing very interesting things with this Marvel Man thing. And so Eclipse got the rights, they thought, to those stories and began to reprint them. But they didn't want to call them Marvel Man because they didn't want to get sued by Marvel. And it wasn't even a case of, they didn't even ask. They were just like, we're just not going to do it. It's going to be Miracle Man. And Alan Moore got so furious about that he didn't want to he didn't want to work with Marvel on anything. And he carried this whole hatred against Marvel as a result of the fact that he felt like they had done this and slighted him. So then years later, when Marvel decided they wanted to reprint the Miracle Man stuff, they bought the rights to the character, right? The 1950s character. Mm-hmm. But then it turned out that Dead Skin never got the fucking rights in the first place. And it would be like if you and I did a Superman comic. Yeah. We just did it.
Yeah, no.
And that became the biggest Superman comic ever. And somebody bought Superman to get the rights to it, but they couldn't have what we did because we did it without getting the rights.
Right.
It's fucking crazy.
And it gets more convoluted.
Yeah.
So, again, where we left off, Marvel Comics objected to the use of Marvel in the title and continued publication in the United States after Warrior's demise.
Right.
Within the metatextual storyline of the comic series itself, it was noted that Marvel Man's creation was based upon Captain Marvel comics by both Moore and later Marvel Man, Miracle Man writer Neil Gaiman.
Right, sure.
So here's when we start getting into some of the legal issues. In 1996, Todd McFarlane purchased Eclipse's creative assets, including the purported Miracle Man rights.
Right. Oh yeah, I forgot about Todd McFarlane. Yeah.
For a total of $25,000.
Right.
In 2001, Gaiman formed Marvels and Miracles LLC, a company whose goal was to clear up the ownership of Miracle Man long term. In 2002, Gaiman sued McFarlane over his unauthorized use of Miracle Man and the characters he had created for Spawn. According to Gaiman, the evidence presented in the course of the lawsuit revealed that the rights for Miracle Man were not included in McFarlane's purchase of the Eclipse Comics assets.
I love it so much. So many people threw so much money at this mess.
Yeah.
And then when Marvel finally got the rights, and they found out they didn't have the rights, they had to reprint the original shitty Marvel Man comics.
Yep.
As if they had fucking found the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
So it was this big thing Marvel is doing, and it's going to be called Marvel Man. And it comes out, and it's shit. It's derivative garbage. It's like the worst knockoff, nothing, produced on the fly, nonsense comics. So funny to me.
So,
and I always wanted to. I only read the first couple of issues, and I always wanted to read the full thing. And that was important to note too.
Now, are we talking about Moore?
Moore's Miracle Man.
Yeah,
is a very different thing from Captain Marvel, right?
Of course.
If someone was to do a Captain Marvel comic and make it like Miracle Man, I would be incensed, or I would just turn myself off to it and make myself not care, because fuck that. But it being a different thing and being a different take on a similar concept, it's very good. It's very good comics.
It's funny that you mentioned this because I'm actually reading the original Miracle Man right now.
Yeah.
It took me a while to piece everything together, but I think I'm only up to like issue 4. So
it's good. I mean, it's good comics.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that when people talk about Alan Moore and they talk about Watchmen and they talk about Swamp Thing and The Killing Joke, Miracle Man seems to be off a lot of people's radar.
Well, that's because people couldn't read it.
How so? Oh, because it was out of print for so long.
Right. The Eclipse issues sold for hundreds of dollars each.
Oh, yeah.
Each.
The issue 15 where he kills Kid Miracle Man.
Right.
I picked that up a number of years ago, well before Marvel finally started reprinting it. Right. I think it's the most I've ever paid for a comic. I think I paid $110 for it.
Sure. And that's why people couldn't read it.
Yeah.
Right. Alan Moore's best book, as far as I'm concerned, my favorite is his Captain Britain that he did with Alan Davis.
Yeah. You've talked about this before.
And that was something that you couldn't fucking get. I mean, it was because he was so mad, and Marvel UK had a different setup. So it's such a way that he had some right to whether or not they ever reprinted it.
Is that the genesis of his feud with Marvel?
No, that's sort of the blowback.
Okay.
The genesis of the feud is that they wouldn't call it Marvel Man in America.
Okay.
And the reason they wouldn't call it Marvel Man was because Eclipse didn't want to fucking ask Marvel. Nobody at Marvel ever said, no, you can't. They would have, but they never did. There's no piece of paper, anything that says anybody from Marvel said you cannot call that book Marvel Man. It was self-censorship. And Alan Moore, being who he is, was like, well, in that case. And it fucked Alan Davis. And Alan Davis had a big falling out with him because it was award-winning comics. Mm-hmm. The Captain Britain, Alan Moore, Alan Davis run was an Eagle Award-winning comic. It was the thing that made British comics enticing to America. All the stuff that happened with the British guys coming to America, it started with Captain Britain and the notice that it was getting.
Now, all that stuff's back in print now, correct?
Finally was, yeah. And how that happened. Actually, let's put a pin in that. We'll talk about that another time. Because that's worthy of its own hour.
Okay. So, to wrap this up, in 2002, Gaiman wrote the 1602 series for Marvel. Gaiman's profits from this series went to Marvels and Miracles LLC to aid his legal fight over Miracle Man. Gaiman's dedication in the collected editions of 1602 reads, in part, to Todd for making it necessary.
Yeah, I remember that.
It emerged in 2009 that original creator Mick Anglo had retained the rights to Marvel Man from the beginning, meaning that the purchase of those rights by Eclipse and McFarlane was illegitimate in any case.
So great.
So in 2009, Marvel Comics purchased the rights to Marvel Man. In 2013, the publisher announced that they had solicited their rights to Miracle Man and that Neil Gaiman would finish the story that he had started 25 years earlier. The first issue, reprinting the recolored and relettered stories from Warrior 1 and 2 and Miracle Man 1, was released on January 15th, 2014. The reprints continued, collecting remastered and recolored work of the original run with hardcover collections following, and in September 2014, the first new Miracle Man material under the Marvel Comics banner was announced. So, here's where it is disappointing as a fan. So the reprints proceeded through issue 16 when the series was retitled Miracle Man: The Golden Age. Mm-hmm. However, after releasing only the first 6 issues, Marvel unexpectedly canceled issues 7 and 8, saying they would be resolicited. It wasn't at a later date.
It wasn't what anyone wanted.
Nearly 2 years later, the publisher has still not released the last 2 issues of the original run. As of now, there's still no updates on when those issues will be released, let alone Gaiman's concluding arc.
Oh, so they didn't publish that stuff?
Never. So it's interesting that Marvel rebranded it Miracle Man: The Golden Age, because Alan Moore wrote.
Okay, so Golden Age didn't refer to the golden age of comics.
So
that was what they called it when they were doing the good stuff.
Well, no. So the way it worked was that the original Miracle Man series was 24 issues. Okay. Alan Moore wrote issues 1 through 16.
Right, and then
Gaiman wrote 17 through 24.
Right.
So the way Marvel did it was they re-released issues 1 through 16 titled as Miracle Man. Okay. Then beginning with issue 17, they started it over and called it Miracle Man: The Golden Age. Okay. It lasted 1 through 6, which was essentially issues 17 through 22. 7 and 8 would have been reprints of the original 23 and 24.
Right.
They never released those.
How hard is it to get those issues from Eclipse?
It took me a couple of years to get it together.
Yeah.
But
see, I never got that into the Gaiman stuff of that. I like the Alan Moore run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, Marvel, all of this legal jargon. Yeah. All of these battles, and for Marvel to finally get it and to fail to reprint the entirety of the original run. Right. And you're absolutely right. You said it best. Nobody cares.
Yeah. Well, that's the sad fact of it. This was something that in 1980 something. This was like holy grail shit. For people that were hip enough to be getting the Eclipse stuff and have it and have read it, that wasn't very many people. I don't know that I knew anybody. Granted, I was a kid, But I didn't really know too many people that were that hip on all this stuff and were able to nail it all down. And it's just, now we've moved past it. Now there's a new Star Wars movie every 5 months, and fandom is a totally different thing. And Miracle Man is a couple of weirdos talking about it at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's we're in a very different place where these things are concerned.
They did release some new material. There was an annual that was written by Grant Morrison that Marvel released shortly after they released issue 16, which would have been the end of Alan Moore's run, and it was, I believe, a story that Grant Morrison wrote years ago, and it was just never published.
Right.
So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, Grant was around then.
Yeah.
Yeah, Grant was kicking around in England at that time.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a serious saga, and in the end, it just seems like it was all for nothing.
Tears in the rain.
Tears in the rain.
I want to give an honorable mention to Tower Comics, who are the publishers of Thunder Agents. That was sort of the original Image type of scene. That was Wally Wood and some of his guys, and those were some great comics. And we're talking about forgotten comic companies and companies that are sort of no longer in the running.
Yeah.
And often spoken of by most people. Tower Comics would definitely have to qualify for that.
Tower Comics, short-lived, only around from 1965 to 1969.
Right.
And I guess to finally conclude this, I thought this was interesting. I didn't know this. This pertains to to Namor. Centaur Publications, also known as Centaur Comics, from 1938 to 1942, was one of the earliest American comic book publishers. During their short existence, they created several colorful characters, including Bill Everett's Amazing Man.
Right.
Everett would later go on to comics fame by introducing Namor the Submariner to Timely.
Yeah.
In 1992, Malibu Comics revived several Centaur heroes.
Yeah.
So,
Bill Everett was a wild cat, man.
how so?
He was just a nutty guy. Namor the Submariner is one of the craziest characters ever. And it came out of his rage and anger at the world.
I think that's another theme with a lot of these comic book guys.
A lot
of rage, a lot of anger.
Well, yeah. I mean, and one of the things, too, is that you figure, okay, working in commercial art would be the best thing you could do, right? If you can't do that, get a newspaper strip. If you can't do that, you work in comics. So a lot of them they were the guys who weren't wired quite right,
Yeah.
They made amazing things.
Yeah, certainly did. Still do.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add?
No, that's good.
All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up.
Wrap it up, dog.
Later.